A good morning to you all. So, during our previous lecture, we managed to discuss with respect to searching and seizing. We went a step further. We defined what searching is. We defined what seizing is. We talked about searching and seizing without a warrant and searching and seizing with a warrant. So, on searching and seizing without a warrant, we agree that if there is consent, if it's an inventory search, if there are exigent circumstances, etc., then there might not be a need for an investigator to obtain a warrant. Then we also went a step further and we described searching and seizing with a warrant. We defined what a warrant is and the processes or the steps that you take when you want to obtain a warrant. So, without wasting much of your time, today we are going to move a step further and we're going to be talking about evidence handling procedures. When we've managed to successfully complete that, we'll move on to digital evidence. But maybe to start, some of you might be asking yourselves, what is evidence? So, evidence simply means proof or confirmation or corroboration. That's what evidence means. So now we want to talk about how an investigator should carry out him or herself during the process of handling evidence. If you want your evidence to be admissible in the court of law, then you have to follow proper evidence handling procedures. Failure to do so will mean or will cause an investigation process not to be successful. Why? Because the evidence would have been tampered around with. So, you will discover that during the evidence handling procedures, an investigator has to adhere to certain steps in order for uh, the evidence to preserve its integrity. So basically, when handling evidence during an investigation, there are certain procedures or certain steps that you ought or that you need to do or to take as an investigator. So, the first procedure is an investigator should actually examine the contents of a hard drive currently placed within a computer, as well as record information about the computer system under examination. What are we basically saying? You will discover that when an incident is reported and the computer emergency response team is alerted of an incident that has actually taken place, When the CERT team comes, or when the incident response team comes, the first thing that they need to do is to actually examine the contents of a hard drive or a computer. A hard drive that is actually stored in a computer, and then they record the information about the computer system under examination. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for instance, someone reports an incident, and maybe the perpetrator of the crime was using a computer, maybe to view pornographic material. So now, when the investigators come, the first thing that they need to do when they are following proper evidence handling procedures is actually to record the information about the computer system that is actually under examination. And during that process of recording information, what kind of information are they actually recording? If it's a computer, they're taking the serial number of the computer. They're also taking the owner of the computer, like basically who is using the computer, and any other information that actually links the computer to the perpetrator. So that's the first procedure that you need to take as an investigator, right? Some of you might be asking, let's say, for instance, in other areas or other fields, the first thing that you maybe ought to do as an investigator maybe is actually to make sure that the crime scene or the area is protected as a way of trying to prevent people who might want to move on the crime scene. So in most instances, let's say, for instance, if it's a crime, if it's not a computer crime or a cyber crime, if it's a physical crime, let's say, for instance, somebody steals something, you know, the law enforcers will come and actually make sure that people do not actually end up compromising the crime scene. But if it's a computer crime, or if we're dealing in computer forensics, we need to actually record information about the computer system under examination. The second procedure will be to take digital photographs of the original system and or media that is being duplicated. You will discover that in computer forensics, or in digital forensics, or in cyber forensics, taking digital photographs of the system or media that is being duplicated is very, very important. Why? When you want to present your evidence in the court of law, you have to show beyond any reasonable doubt that the evidence was not planted after the incident has occurred. So, as a way of trying to protect ourselves as investigators, we need to take digital photographs of the original system or media that is being duplicated. The third procedure when you're handling evidence is you need to fill out an evidence tag for the original media or for the forensic duplication. So, depending on the design that you might want to take or to make, basically an evidence tag is used for the identification of the evidence. And the evidence tag can be used to show the chain of possession. So, an evidence tag might actually, on the contents of an evidence tag, you might find a case number, an item number, description of the evidence, the date and time, as well as the investigation officer. So what I'm basically saying is, depending on the design or how you design your evidence tag, there are certain pieces of information that it ought to have as a way of being visible when an investigator wants to actually identify the evidence. So the third procedure when you're handling evidence is actually to fill out an evidence tag for the original media or for the copy of the original media that we actually call the forensic duplication. So the fourth procedure is actually to label all media appropriately with an evidence label. The fourth procedure is actually to label all media appropriately with an evidence label. So an evidence label is also going to contain information such as the agency or the investigator, who actually collected the evidence, the date and time, the case number, the item number, the location, as well as remarks if there are any. And it can also have an area of chain of custody during or on that evidence label. The fifth step, we're basically saying an investigator should actually store the best evidence copy of the evidence media in your evidence safe. So, storage or storing the evidence is of utmost importance to the investigator. Why? Because if there is no evidence, there is no case. If there is no case, which means we might end up spending so much money at the end of the day and try to identify who the perpetrator of a particular incident is. So, as an investigator, it is very, very important for you to actually store the best evidence copy of the evidence media in an evidence safe. So, an evidence safe will actually be used to store the best evidence copy or the original media of a particular incident. So, the sixth procedure, we're basically saying an evidence custodian actually enters a record of the best evidence into the evidence log. So during this stage, we have what we call an evidence custodian. The purposes of an evidence custodian is for him to be in a better position to actually establish what we call a chain of custody. Like, let's say, for instance, during an investigation, a case is actually handled by 3 or more investigators. We're basically saying it's the duty of the evidence custodian to show us how evidence was distributed from one investigator to another. And while we're busy doing that, we'll be logging, or we'll be inputting some certain piece of information in what we call an evidence log. So once we've managed to successfully do that, the seventh step is we're basically saying all examinations are performed on a forensic copy of the best evidence that we actually call a working copy. So, as what I said when we're discussing the incident response methodology, we said at a particular point when evidence is seized, or when we seize a particular uh, evidence media, when we seize that evidence media, we take that evidence media to our forensic workstation, to our forensic lab. We said we do not touch the best evidence, or we do not touch the original media, or we do not touch the original copy. However, we perform what we call a forensic duplication, or a qualified forensic duplication, or we create a mirror image where we're basically trying to create working copies. These working copies are forensic copies that we actually use during our data analysis, such that in the event that we tamper around with those working copies, or we compromise the integrity of those working copies, we can as well retrieve other working copies from our original media. But let's say, for instance, I just want you to imagine in the event that maybe we use, we perform our analysis on an original media, and we tamper around with the integrity of that original media. Then at the end of the day, we might end up not having a case that we, or our evidence might not be admissible in the court of law. So we're basically saying all examinations are actually performed on a forensic copy of the best evidence, which we actually call a working copy. The eighth step, or the eighth procedure, we're basically saying it is the duty of an evidence custodian to ensure that backup copies of the best evidence are created. I guess this is actually self-explanatory. It is the duty of an evidence custodian to actually ensure that backup copies of the best evidence are created. On our ninth step, we're basically saying an evidence custodian actually ensures that all disposition dates are met. The dates of evidence disposition are assigned by the principal investigators. So we're basically saying you will discover that sometimes as investigators we have what we call dispositions. So a disposition date is simply the date of which the outcome of a particular case or the outcome of a particular incident actually occurred. That's what we call a disposition date. So we're basically saying the evidence custodian should ensure that the date of the outcome of a particular case or incident when it occurred actually met. Then last but not least, we're basically saying an evidence custodian should actually perform a monthly audit. The purpose of this monthly audit is basically to ensure that all the best evidence is present, is properly stored, and is labeled. So the best evidence is simply the original evidence or the original media. So basically, the procedures that we have been discussing about on the previous slide can be illustrated by the diagram on the presentation as follows. We're basically saying we have our original media. Our original media is simply our best evidence. So we're basically saying at this particular stage, we need to actually identify the computer media or the target media and record all the details of the system, as well as take photographs of the system prior to the creation of working copies, or the creation of copies that we actually use to when we're investigating. Then, once we've performed the forensic duplication, we need to put an evidence tag as well as to label the evidence. And once we have done that, the evidence needs to be stored on an evidence safe. So we're basically saying it is the best evidence or the original evidence that is actually stored on the evidence safe. When we've done that, we're basically saying it is the duty of the evidence custodian to actually create backup copies of the evidence, or which we call the working copies. So we're basically saying an investigation can have can have 2 or more working copies, depending on the policy, and also depends on the number of investigators that are actually working on the case. So at the end of the day, we're basically saying as an investigator, you need to make sure that when you're handling evidence, you follow the proper evidence handling procedures. Since we're now familiar with the evidence handling procedures, and during the course of trying to describe these procedures or these steps, we've been constantly talking about evidence, 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 evidence. So now, we now want to move a step further and discuss with respect to digital evidence. So, digital evidence, the word digital evidence, if we want to try and define it, we might look into it in terms of 2 perspectives. We have 2 words, digital as well as evidence. So the moment you talk about digital, we're simply representing data in zeros and ones. And the moment we talk about evidence, we simply said we are talking about some proof or some confirmation. So you will discover that as an investigator, when we're talking about computer forensics, there is need for you to be in a better position to actually collect digital evidence as well as to analyze digital evidence in a forensically sound manner. So, digital evidence can be defined as information that is of value that can actually be stored or transmitted in a digital form. We're basically saying when we talk about digital evidence, there has to be some piece of information that has value, and that information can either be stored or transmitted in a digital form. Some of you might be wondering how digital information can be collected or how digital information can be gathered. So we're basically saying this digital information can be collected while we're actually examining digital storage media, when we're monitoring the network traffic, or when we're making the duplicate copies of the digital data that is actually found during the forensic investigation. So these are some of the ways or means or methods in which digital information can be collected or gathered. So digital evidence in forensics is usually found in files such as graphic files, audio and video recording and files, internet browser histories, server logs, word processing and spreadsheet files, emails, as well as log files. So, as a forensic investigator, it is important for you to actually know the various areas where digital evidence can be found, so that if you fail to actually identify or if you do not have the technical know-how on where to actually find this digital evidence, you might end up losing critical evidence or critical information or information that might be vital to a particular case. So it is important for us to know where some of this digital evidence may be found or where it can be stored. There are what we call challenging aspects of digital evidence. We're basically saying the first challenge is forensic investigators uh, face challenges of preserving digital evidence, as it might be in a chaotic form of evidence and it is critical to handle it correctly. We're basically saying during the process of trying to gather data or trying to gather evidence, the forensic investigator might be overwhelmed with the number of information or the number of data that is there, to such an extent that the forensic investigator might end up compromising the integrity of the evidence, since some of the information might actually be in a chaotic form. So this is one of the major challenges that are usually faced by investigators when they're trying to collect digital evidence. We're also saying during the investigation, it can be altered maliciously or unintentionally without leaving any traces. Like what I was saying, sometimes uh, while you're trying to collect digital evidence, some malware might actually um, alter the evidence, or sometimes unknowingly one might tamper around or alter the evidence. without actually leaving a trace. So that's another challenge that investigators face when we're talking about digital evidence. Sometimes we're basically saying there is an abstraction of some events when the investigator performs some tasks on the computer. The resulting activity creates data remnants that gives an incomplete view of the actual evidence. Data remnants are simply that data that is actually left out after someone actually tries to wipe out information. So we're basically saying that can be a challenge as well. Then we're also saying digital evidence is circumstantial, which makes it difficult for forensic investigators to trace the system's activities. When we're trying to um, when we're trying to investigate a particular incident, um, some of the evidence that we might find uh, might be circumstantial, which usually makes it difficult for investigators to actually trace the system's activities. So basically, these are some of the challenges or challenging aspects of digital evidence. The role of digital evidence. The role or the roles of digital. So, some of the roles of digital evidence is that um, digital evidence is supposed to actually establish a credible link between the attacker, the victim, and the crime scene. That is very, very important because without establishing a credible link, it will be difficult to actually pinpoint or to put a particular perpetrator to a crime scene or to a particular victim to a crime scene. So, one of the roles of digital evidence is actually to establish a credible link between the attacker, the victim, and the crime scene. In computer forensics, we have what we call the Locard's exchange principle. So the Locard exchange principle simply states that anyone or anything entering a crime scene takes something of the scene with them and leaves something of themselves behind when they leave. So this principle, if we want to look at it closely, that's why you see, let's say for instance, um, when we're talking about if somebody breaks into your house, when someone breaks into your house, that person might actually leave his fingerprints behind, and maybe when you are trying to break into the house, maybe that person actually uh, hurt or harm himself when you are trying to enter or to break in. Maybe that person actually created a scar on his hand. So we're basically saying that person might leave traces of blood um, on the crime scene as well as his fingerprints. Then when he goes, that scar might be a hint or a clue or something that will actually help us to actually pinpoint that perpetrator of the crime. So basically, the Locard exchange principle is basically states that anyone or anything actually entering a crime scene will actually take something of the scene with them and leave something of themselves behind. So, as much as that person actually takes, maybe it might be uh, a laptop, that person might also leave his or her fingerprints. So basically, that's what the Locard exchange principle states. So, for example, at the time of crime, if, if any information from the victim's computer is stored on the server or the system itself, the investigator can trace that information by examining log files, internet browsing, history, etc. So this is simply an example that is also trying to explain the Locard exchange principle. We have what we call characteristics of digital evidence. We're basically saying the digital evidence must have some characteristics to be disclosed in the court of law. So the first and most important characteristic is what we call admissible. You will find that since we started this module, we have been talking so much with respect to evidence should be admissible in the court of law, evidence should be preserved in a forensically sound manner in order for that evidence to be admissible in the court of law. And now we're basically saying in digital evidence, there are characteristics of digital evidence, and the first one is admissible. When we say evidence or digital evidence should be admissible, basically what we're simply trying to say is we're simply saying evidence must be related to the fact being proved. There has to be a relationship that coexists between uh, the facts and what needs to be proved. That's what we call admissible. So we're basically saying evidence must be related to the fact being proved. That's one characteristic of digital evidence. Another characteristic is authentic. When something is authentic, that thing is actually real or is actually genuine. So we're basically saying evidence must be real and related to the incident in a proper way. The third characteristic, we're basically saying digital evidence should be complete. Complete in the sense that evidence must prove the attacker's actions or his innocence. When you provide digital evidence, you are supposed not to leave any room for doubt. So at the end of the day, we basically say that digital evidence has to be complete in the sense that it must actually prove the attacker's actions or his innocence. Another characteristic of digital evidence is reliable. There must be no doubt about the authenticity or veracity of the evidence. Digital evidence has to be reliable. Last but not least, digital evidence has to be believable. Evidence must be clear and understandable by judges. Evidence must actually be clear and understandable by judges. So, these are some of the characteristics of digital evidence. We have what we call fragility of digital evidence. We have what we call fragility of digital evidence. So digital evidence is fragile in nature or is delicate in nature. During the investigation of the crime scene, if the computer is turned off, then the data which is not saved can be lost permanently. And also, if the computer is connected to the internet, the person involved in the crime may delete the evidence by deleting the log files. Digital evidence is also fragile in the sense that after the incident, if a user writes any data to the system, it may actually overwrite the crime scene. So, as an investigator, it is important for you to have a clear understanding or to appreciate that when you are dealing with digital evidence, when you are investigating on digital evidence, you have to have the necessary tools to collect data, and sometimes you have to collect that data swiftly and quickly in a forensically sound manner. We're going to show during the course of this module, we're going to show you how to collect volatile data. So we're basically saying digital evidence is fragile in the sense that if the computer is turned off, then some of the data might be lost, as well as the attacker or the perpetrator of the crime or the perpetrator of the incident, if the machine is actually connected remotely or to the internet, then that attacker might actually delete the evidence by actually deleting the log files. And we're also saying when an incident occurs and if information is actually written to a particular hard drive, then that overwriting might actually cause us to actually lose some evidence. In digital evidence, we have what we call anti-digital forensics or anti-forensic techniques. So anti-digital forensics is basically an approach to actually manipulate, erase, or obfuscate the digital data. So to obfuscate is simply to make something unclear. So it makes the forensic examination difficult, time-consuming, or impossible. So on anti-digital forensic techniques, we basically have 4 categories of anti-digital forensics. We have what we call overwriting data and metadata, also referred to as wiping. So this technique actually destroys any potential incriminating data by multiple overwrites. So 0 or random numbers actually used to overwrite the actual data. Our second category of anti-digital forensic or an anti-digital forensic technique, we have what we call exploitation of bugs in forensic tools. We're basically saying Forensic imaging and analysis tools are programmed to misread the files. For example, a text file may be read as an executable file. The moment you use such forensic tools, we're basically saying you've actually managed to manipulate a certain piece of digital data, thereby causing it difficult for a forensic examination to take place. Another category of anti-digital forensics with what we call obfuscation of data. Obfuscation of data is intended to confuse the forensic analysts. It is created by using anonymous remailers to strip the email headers information, or a bootable USB or CD or DVD is also used to compromise the system or network. So the goal of obfuscation of data is simply to confuse the forensic analysts. So obfuscation of data is also an anti-digital forensic technique. Last but not least, we have what we call hiding data. So on hiding data, one can actually use steganography or cryptography. We're basically saying confidential data is hidden under the images, that is steganography. The moment you actually hide data on an image, on a video, or on an audio file, we say that is steganography. Also, messages are actually encrypted using strong cryptographic algorithms which cannot be decrypted by analysts. Through low-tech methods, data or information is hidden from an examiner. So basically, these are the four categories or the four anti-digital forensic techniques that are there. We have various types of digital data or types of digital data. We have what we call volatile data. So volatile data can be modified, and it contains system time, logged on users, open files, network information, process information, process to port mapping, process memory, clipboard, service, driver, information, and command history. So when we look at volatile data is simply data that might be lost in the event that maybe our computer is actually switched off. That is volatile data. Then we have what we call non-volatile data. Non-volatile data is used for the secondary storage and is long-term persisting. Non-volatile data contains hidden files, slack space, swap files, index.files, unallocated clusters, unused partitions, hidden partitions, registry settings, as well as event logs. So non-volatile data, we basically say this type of data cannot be lost when a computer actually switches off. So it's some say this type of data is usually stored in permanent memory. We also have what we call transient data. So transient data contains information such as open network connection, user logout, programs that reside in memory and cache data. If the machine is turned off, all this information is lost permanently. So, transient data is an example of, or is a type of, volatile data. Then we have what we call fragile data. Fragile data is that information that is temporarily saved on the hard disk and can be changed. It contains information such as last access time stamps, access date on files, etc.